We're live.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dina Baxt, and I am a co-president of A Better Balance. And thank you so much for joining our webinar today to discuss the urgent need for paid leave, family leave in New York State. Hopefully you can all see the webinar slides, and I'm going to proceed. 2 minutes after 2, I think we're ready to begin. So let me just begin with a very quick introduction on why paid family leave is so urgent. Even though most workers will experience the need to provide care for a loved one at some point in their lives, there's no federal law which provides workers with paid leave when a loved one is seriously ill or a new child is born or adopted. Only 12% of private sector workers in the U.S. have access to paid leave, and low-wage workers, who are most likely to depend on every paycheck when a new child arrives or a loved one is ill, are even less likely to have access to paid family leave. A mere 5% of workers in the bottom quarter of private sector wage earners receive paid leave, family leave. And at A Better Balance, we see how the need to sacrifice pay or a job in order to care for a loved one can have long-lasting economic consequences for working family. The birth of a new child can lead to severe financial strains that may result in poverty or bankruptcy, with 1/4 of poverty spells resulting from a child's birth. Families can also find themselves in debt or bankruptcy when they face increased expenses related to the health or caregiving needs of a seriously ill child or elderly loved one. We've heard from countless workers in New York State who are disillusioned with the lack of supportive workplace laws and policies during these key moments. And many have contacted our organization's legal clinic for low-wage workers, and hundreds have shared their stories with us. We've also talked to numerous workers whose families have been lucky enough to have paid family leave through their employer, as well as employers who provide paid leave because they feel it's the right thing to do for their workers and their company's bottom line. And the enthusiasm and support we've encountered in New York State for paid family leave is reflected in broader polling on the issue. A 2009 statewide poll of New York voters showed widespread support for paid family leave. 76% favored or strongly favored extending New York's current temporary disability insurance program to provide up to 12 weeks a year for paid family leave. This support was especially significant among women, with 82% of New York State women favored or strongly favored paid family leave. And in a recent poll, 83% of New York small business owners supported extending the state's existing temporary disability insurance program via small employee contribution to cover caring for a new baby or seriously ill family member. Later in the webinar, we'll share more details about how paid family leave in New York would actually work. In addition to the widespread support for paid family leave is so popular in New York and throughout the country because the policy would provide valuable benefits to diverse groups across society. Paid family leave has positive effects for women, for children, for LGBT families, male caregivers, the elderly, and business, in the form of increased workforce attachment for mothers, better rates of breastfeeding, savings for business through retention of employees, and reduced stress for families and caregivers, among numerous other benefits. And we at A Better Balance have documented many of these benefits in our latest report, Investing in Our Families, the Case for Paid Family Leave and the Nation. Today we have 4 fantastic presenters who will highlight some powerful new data and research underscoring the urgent need for paid family leave. Our first presenter, Deb Kaplan from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, will discuss the city's new research and statistics on the employment of pregnant women in New York City and their return to work following birth. Our next speaker, Nancy Rankin, will discuss a new Community Service Society report on low-wage working moms in New York City and some of the report stories. Then Liz DeLauro of 0 to 3 will address why paid family leave is critical to the healthy development of both children and families. And finally, my colleague Sherry Lewan of A Better Balance will speak to the overall need for paid family leave beyond maternity leave and discuss the status of the issue nationally, how our bill in New York would work, and what people can do to get involved. We'll then open it up to Q&A, and we encourage folks to type in questions on the webinar system throughout the presentation. We will then collect them and set some time aside at the end to address them. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our first panelist. Just want to make sure Deb Kaplan is on, if she made it on. If not, we will turn over to Nancy Rankin. Deb, are you there? Okay, we were having a little technical difficulties with Deb, so she should be on shortly. So Nancy, I would like to first introduce Nancy Rankin, who is the Vice President of Policy Research and Advocacy for Community Service Society, where she leads the work on labor, housing, youth, and income inequality. She's the founder of the Unheard Third, a regular survey of low-income New Yorkers, and has written and spoken widely on issues affecting upward mobility of low-wage workers and the challenges of meeting work and family responsibilities. She's on the steering committee of the New York State Paid Family Leave Campaign, and Nancy is a graduate of Cornell and Princeton. Nancy.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
And so you can hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're good,
Okay.
Nancy.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, the kind introduction, Dina. Dina talked about some of the statistics, and particularly how low-income women are most likely to lack any paid family leave. And so in our research, we wanted to get behind the numbers, particularly for low-income new moms who are working during their pregnancies, to understand how they manage in the absence of guaranteed paid family leave. So can I ask you to go to the next slide?
That's it.
Okay. So were they able to take time off? How long? But also to really understand what was driving their decisions. How did they feel? How did it affect their lives, their ability to care for their new babies and to support their families? And a good way to explore sensitive issues in depth and to kind of get below the surface is through qualitative research, for example, focus groups. And we did a series of professionally done focus groups with my colleague, Margaret Mark. The participants in our groups had all been working during the pregnancies and all had children less than a year old. Half of them were below poverty and the other half were between poor and twice the federal poverty level. Most of them were Black and Latina, but included everyone. Some of the groups, the women had returned to their jobs, and one group, the women had not yet returned to work. They had left the labor force. We also made an effort to have half of the participants employed by firms with under 50 employees and half by 50 or more, so that we could capture the impact of the FMLA, which provides at least unpaid leave, or at least in theory. I also just wanted to mention that this is part of a larger research effort comparing the experiences of the low-income moms in a state like New York without paid family leave with moms just across the river in New Jersey, in Newark, in Camden, and Trenton who have access to paid family leave. I'm just reporting on the New York findings, but in another several months we'll be reporting on the comparisons. Can I have the next slide? So despite their low wages, prior to having these babies, the women managed pretty much okay. They told us that they were able to pay their bills, they could work more hours if needed, and they were basically managing despite their low incomes. But late during their pregnancies is when things really started to go downhill for them. So they told us things like, basically, I got fired because I couldn't do the job as I was doing it before they found out I was pregnant. Someone who was working at Target at a balloon place, she had to lift a helium tank, and she said, I can't do that anymore. The next day she came in and she was let go. So we heard from women who were forced out from their jobs despite New York City's law requiring reasonable accommodation. So that was the first sense of problems occurring. The next slide, please. The other problem the women faced was the lack of clear policies on leave and job security. So many of them told us they were led to believe they would have maternity leave, but the reality was that maternity leave just meant they could use any saved vacation or sick days, which for these low-wage workers didn't amount to much. So typical comments were they said there was maternity leave, but it's a lie. It's not really maternity leave if it's using your own vacation. I got a week of vacation days, and the other week I didn't get paid at all. I don't think I got a goodbye, which led to a lot of feelings of resentment. There was also a great deal of uncertainty about whether they would even have a job to return to. Typical of the kinds of comments we heard was, well, they made it seem like I would have the job back, but I guess for some reason, I guess I was out too long and they gave my position away. Or no pay, nothing, you decided to have a kid, bye. You'll have your job when you come back, but don't take too long and then you won't have a job. And what was too long? There were no written policies, and all of this created even more anxiety. The next slide. These women had basically almost no information about any of the laws that we already have on the books. And for those laws, those that had a bit of information experienced challenges getting those benefits. And this was despite the fact that many of the women in these focus groups were employed by major retailers, by restaurant chains, by JFK Airport. So these weren't just people working in little, mom and pop businesses. Many of them, half of them, were working for larger companies. So typical what we heard were things like, when I was going to take my leave, I knew they weren't going to pay me. I thought about trying to do some research about getting disability. Would I have qualified? And they talked about the paperwork. Who is going to do all this footwork? Do I have to go buy a fax machine to do this back and forth? So there was virtually no knowledge of the FMLA, of TDI, or the new laws requiring accommodations for pregnant workers. And it's especially troubling because the TDI law has been around for decades, and the employer by law is actually required to notify a worker who's disabled more than 7 days about their rights to TDI benefits. This just never happened. And also despite the fact that workers actually contribute to in this insurance through weekly payroll deductions. The next slide. So as a result of not knowing that they might have had job security, job protection from the FMLA, or that they could have had some TDI to provide at least $170 a week, they felt forced to return to work very quickly, some in as few as 2 or 3 weeks, due to the financial pressures to try to survive and their fear of losing their job. We thought it was really surprising the amount of intense pressure these women got from their employers. I remember one of them saying she got a call while she was still in the hospital, and she thought they were calling to congratulate her. She hadn't even left the hospital yet, but actually they were calling to say, so when are you coming back? And there are some examples of the kinds of comments we heard. Someone who had premature twins, 2 weeks after they got home, they called her, are you ready to come back to work now? She said, they just came home. I had to go back to work. I had no choice. Another woman said, I wanted to be home. I had no choice. I spent literally 3 weeks with my baby, and I had to go back to work. Someone else went back to work in 2 weeks. And the final comment, someone saying that, I wish I had the option to stay home. I would stay home, especially since he was premature. But like everyone's saying here, they have bills. I have to eat. My baby has to eat. The rent has to be paid. So I have to go back. I feel like there's no option. So this is a theme here, that these low-income workers felt like they really had no choice, no option. The next slide, please. In terms of the negative impacts, they spoke about the financial anxiety. Everything is budgeted. I'm in constant fear, waking up in the middle of the night, worrying about falling behind on payment plans. Many of them told us about having to borrow money. When you don't have money, it's like, the baby needs diapers, the baby needs something. What are we going to do? Oh, my God, who are we going to ask? We already asked that person. They talked about not having time to bond with their new infants. And they talked about their physical health problems. This was a woman who ran down the stairs who was in the catering business. She was back to work just 3 weeks after a C-section, and she ripped apart her stitches. They talked about despair and depression. I lost my job when I was pregnant, and I got really depressed. So think about all of these elements coming together. So you have the postpartum hormone changes, and in that context, you have enormous worries about money, anxiety about whether you'll still have your job, the stress and demands of caring for a new infant, lack of sleep, and all of this combined is a recipe for bad things and crisis. The next slide. The lack of paid leave also undermined employee morale and labor force participation. So we had, for example, the second quote here, someone saying they had a really good relationship with the company before, a good relationship with their boss, their coworkers, but after I came back, it is like I don't even want to be bothered. I didn't have no consideration when I was out. I don't feel like I was on the team anymore. Do you feel like the employers just don't care? They want you to do the job, that's it. They don't care that you're leaving your baby with a stranger, and emotionally you're a wreck when you go back to work. So this was really undermining their employee morale, and you'll hear we frequently talk about how if we had paid leave, it would be good for employee morale, and this is the flip side. Even more troubling in many ways were the stories we heard from the moms who weren't able to return to work at all, who were described having to resort to living on public assistance, borrowing, being dependent on family, and feeling very much in limbo. The next slide. At the end of the session, we described the proposal that's now being weighed by the legislature in New York and asked them, well, what difference would it have made for you? What difference would it make in your life? And these are a sample of the kinds of comments that we heard. I think we need to go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. People said, I think it would be amazing if parents had enough time to bond with their children. I would feel appreciated as an employee. Productivity would be great. Maybe depression would be less. I feel like I'd be less stressed, more positive. I'd feel better about myself, appreciate it. And you saw that a lot of the women were able to articulate a very big picture perspective about how it would be less costly for taxpayers in the long run because they wouldn't be dependent on public programs and safety net programs, and how it would even be better for business. I think you let them know it's beneficial to their companies as a whole for the morale of the company. Final slide. So we often talk about the cost of paid family leave, but I think we also need to think about the big cost of not having paid family leave. And this research on the focus groups really shed light on the human and the economic toll from lack of paid family leave. In terms of the policy conversation, I would say there are two takeaways from our research. One, that job security is critical, along with partial wage replacement and adequate time, adequate number of weeks. And secondly, that information and enforcement of both the existing laws on the books and any new laws we create is really a very important component. The full report is available online at our website, cssny.org, as well as video clips of some of the women that were in the focus groups that we spoke to. So let me close there.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Nancy, for that really excellent report on why paid family leave is a necessity and not a benefit. And, the information that you share about notice and lack of knowledge is a problem that we see up close to at A Better Balance. And I just want to make a plug in the spirit of public education that in New York City and New York State, we have a book, pregnant women and new mothers are entitled to 6 to 8 weeks of job protection to recover from childbirth. So that's the period of disability. So we have a lot of work to do to get the word out on that, and obviously that needs to be paid. But at a minimum now, women in New York City and state will have that level of job protection when there are 4 or more employees. So it's a start. It's not where we need to be, and we have a lot of work to get the word out, but that's just important to underscore. Deb Kaplan, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Okay. So I'd now like to introduce. Yeah, it was a little glitch, but now we're all good. Okay. So Dr. Deborah Kaplan has served as Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Maternal, Infant, and Reproductive Health since 2003. The Bureau works to achieve equitable and improved outcomes for women, families, and children in New York City. Dr. Kaplan has over 30 years public health experience. She received her training as a physician assistant at Johns Hopkins University, holds a master's in public health from Hunter College, and a doctorate in public health from the CUNY School of Public Health. So, Deb, turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for this opportunity to present our findings on employment among pregnant women in New York City and return to work after giving birth. And I think our findings really complement what Nancy just presented in her research. Next slide, please. Today I'm going to share recently published data from our PRAMS survey. PRAMS is the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System, describing the work status of New York City mothers during their pregnancies and following the birth of their child, as well as their leave-taking experiences and factors that influence when they return to work. Next slide. So PRAMS is overseen by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and it's conducted in 40 states and New York City. New York City is the only city that conducts PRAMS. And when you combine all the states in New York City, the overall national sample represents 78% of births in the United States. So every year in New York City, there's about 120,000 births. The PRAMS sample, which is approximately 2,200 women each year, is selected to reflect the demographics of women who give birth in New York City. And women are surveyed 8 or more weeks after giving birth each year. We've been doing PRAMS in New York City for many years, but starting in 2012, our PRAMS survey began asking questions related to women's employment and leave-taking. And in addition to New York City, 12 other states also asked leave questions, though New York City is the first to analyze these data and report on them publicly. Next slide. First, I'm going to start by talking about what we found just in employment overall, and then talk about leave-taking. So in both cases, we found marked inequality, and I'm going to focus again first on employment. More than half, that is 57% of New York City women who gave birth in 2012 reported that they had worked for pay during their most recent pregnancy. Not surprisingly, employment was highly associated with age and education. Women who were college graduates were significantly more likely to have worked during their pregnancy than those with the highest level of educational attainment. Than those whose highest level of educational attainment was high school. In fact, 40% of women with a high school degree or less worked at some point during their pregnancy, compared with 75% of college graduates. Similarly, the likelihood of being employed increased with age. We found that 63% of women 35 or older worked during their pregnancy, compared to 51% of those under 24. We observed that women stay in the workplace after having children. 61% of women having their first or second birth, and almost half, 47% of women with 2 or more previous births, reported working during their most recent pregnancy. Racial and ethnic disparities in employment among pregnant women were evident. 72% of white mothers worked for pay during their most recent pregnancy, compared to 57% of Hispanic mothers, 52% of black mothers, and 36% of Asian Pacific Islander mothers. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the type of leave or time off after giving birth for New York City mothers. So overall, 72% of working mothers returned to the job they held during their pregnancy. And of these mothers, 39% took only unpaid leave off. You can see that in the green part of the pie, while 41% reported taking only paid leave. In regards to paid leave, it's important to note that it was undefined in the survey and could have been interpreted by respondents to include accrued vacation and sick time, which we know many mothers use to take off after they give birth, time for which they receive New York State temporary disability insurance benefits, and or maternity leave by an employer. For us to get a better sense of what percent of this 41% is actually women who receive true employer-sponsored paid leave, national data may be instructive. 2011 data from across the country indicates that just 11% of U.S. private sector workers and 17% of public sector workers had access to paid family leave through an employer. So this national data helps us understand and better interpret that 41% that you see in the orange part of the pie of women reporting paid leave only. In addition, in the blue is the 16% of women who reported taking both paid and unpaid leave. One important note is that, unfortunately, information on the duration of leave was not available. However, based on us analyzing this data and reporting that limitation to the Center for Disease Control, they fast-tracked a change in future rounds of the survey so that starting in 2016, because of our identification of this limitation, New York City and all the states that are conducting the survey, the other 12, will be having information on the duration of leave. And this really ties well to Nancy's point about the report of many women who reported returning within 2 to 3 weeks after giving birth. We will, starting in 2016 data, be able to actually look at the percent of women who return and by when they return to work. Next slide. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we observed higher education and higher income level increased the likelihood that women reported at least some paid leave. Education was associated with having at least some paid leave off, with 72% of college graduates compared to 40% of women whose highest level of education was high school were more likely to have some paid leave. Low-income mothers were more likely to take only unpaid leave off. 69% of women below the federal poverty level compared to 25% of those over the 200% of the federal poverty level took unpaid leave only. Another inequity that we observed. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the percent of women who selected each of the options to the question, did any of the things listed below affect your decision about leave taking from work after your baby was born? And to note that respondents could choose as many of these items as they wanted, so it doesn't add up to 100%. About 1/3 of women who returned to work reported that their decision was influenced by the job not having paid leave, that's 33%, and or that they could not financially afford to take leave, 32%. Nearly 1 in 5, or 18%, reported that they had not built up enough leave time to take any or more time off. And 22%, or more than 1 in 5 women, reported that fear of job loss affected why they returned to work. Next slide. As we looked at this data, we decided to look at the relationship between food insecurity and leave taking after birth. And I'll note that PRAMS asked many different questions, and there are opportunities to look at other associations as well between leave taking. But we specifically zeroed in on food insecurity. And in this survey, food insecurity is defined as mothers reporting concerns that they did not have enough food to feed themselves and their family in the last 30 days. And we know that basically the financial need to go to work, back to work, was also reflected in reports of food insecurity. Food insecurity is an issue for many New York City families, with nearly 1 in 4, or 23% of mothers who give birth in New York City reporting food insecurity. That alone is of great concern. And then when we look at it in relation to unpaid or paid leave, women who only took unpaid time off were more likely to report concerns about having enough food for their family compared to those who had at least some paid leave. That was 26% compared to 16%. So what are our next steps? We are planning, and this is one great opportunity, to disseminate our findings far and wide. We seek as many opportunities as possible to disseminate our findings. We will be conducting further analysis of the 2012 data set to examine associations between leave taking and other factors such as maternal depression. And we will be analyzing the 2013 data set as soon as it is available. If you are interested in getting more of our data, we published this data in what's called an EPI-Data Brief, and it was published in April 2015, and the title is Employment Among Pregnant Women in New York City and Return to Work After Giving Birth. The URL is available. It is stated on the slide you're looking at right now. And that is the end of my presentation. As noted earlier, questions will be taken at the end of all the presentations. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Deb. That was an excellent presentation and very enlightening. New research and statistics on the scope of the problem, and we'll take questions at the end for you. I'd now like to turn it over to Liz DeLauro, who is the Director of Advocacy at 0 to 3, the leading national organization committed to promoting the health and development of infants and toddlers. In this role, Liz develops and coordinates 0 to 3 strategies to engage professionals in advocacy on behalf of infants, toddlers, and their families. Prior to joining 0 to 3, she worked in children's advocacy with Pew Charitable Trusts, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and Hippie USA. Liz is based in Washington, D.C. Liz?
Hi, thank you so much, Dina. I'm really pleased to join the panel today, especially as a former New Yorker, even though I am now based in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to spend a few minutes today walking through the child development case for paid family leave. So why is it so important for the healthy development of babies? So at 0 to 3, we're obviously very invested in helping to secure the best beginning possible for babies. And we really do see paid family leave as one of the core strategies to support families in doing so right from the beginning. We can move to the next slide. All right, and so I thought I would start with a quick national picture to complement the great New York-specific information that you're hearing today. So we know that nationally the majority of mothers with infants, so 62%, are in the workforce. So that's the number of mothers with babies under the age of 1. But the number of them who have access to paid maternity leave is much lower and is pretty bleak. So just 22% of those working in the private sector work for companies that offer paid leave to all female employees. And then when we look at the same statistic for new fathers, the picture is even worse. So only 9% of private sector workers are at companies that offer paid paternity leave to all male employees. And then finally, we know that a full 1/2 of first-time mothers take any paid time off, and that's even a day when they either have or adopt their children. So it's just half. And we can move to the next slide. So the statistics aren't good, but what does that really mean for babies and young children? So decades upon decades of research and clinical experience as well really do demonstrate that the health and development of babies are directly influenced by their earliest relationships with both their parents and then their other caregivers as well. So it follows that to support babies, we really need to start with the parents. Infants and toddlers, they essentially experience the world through their primary caregivers. So these early relationships really do become the portals through which each individual first encounters the world. They literally shape the architecture of the developing brain for young children. And so for babies, every interaction is a lesson in how the world works, how individuals relate to one another, and then how they're valued as well. So caring, consistent relationships for young children, they truly do set the stage for how they cope with experiences throughout the rest of their lives. So when we talk about parental leave, we often talk about the gift of time. The birth or adoption of a baby requires us to really take a step back from the flow of daily life, not only to adjust to new demands for feeding or for night wakings or being up all night, essentially, but to really decipher the nuanced patterns and the communications of a newborn. So during this time, babies and their caregivers develop what we call their unique developmental dance, in which each of them becomes highly attuned to the other, to the cues of the other one, and they learn how to respond to them as well. And as those of us who are parents know, it's really not easy to do this. It's a hard job. I'm not sure that I've ever actually figured out my son's hungry cries versus his tired cries or what have you. But the success with which we accomplish all of this at the beginning really does lay the foundation for future relationships. And then when these developmental tasks go unattended, so when this unique developmental dance breaks down or it stops, babies really learn that they can't rely on their caregivers to meet their needs, and that has implications for their attachment. So the role of relationships, I think, is really perfectly captured by a quote from Urie Bronfenbrenner when he says that every baby really needs time with their caregiver who is simply just crazy about them. We can go to the next slide. So unfortunately, when it comes to this early gift of time, vulnerable babies have the most to lose. So nationally, close to every other infant and toddler in the United States, a full 48%, live in a family that is poor or near poor. In New York State, there's pretty similar statistics, with 44% of children under the age of 3 living in families that are poor or near poor. And our current policy, disproportionately jeopardizes the development of babies living in these households because the parents of them are less likely than more affluent parents to have access even to the unpaid leave provided by FMLA. And then if they do have FMLA benefits, they often can't afford to use them because they're not getting those paychecks, obviously. So children living in these households also sort of have what we call a double whammy. Many of their parents, they're working multiple shifts and they're working long hours, and the quality of the child care that children need to support their development is really often out of reach. And so I have a few statistics to illustrate this. So the average cost of full-time center-based child care for an infant ranges quite a bit across the country, from a low of about $5,500 a year in Mississippi to more than $18,000 a year in Washington, D.C. And in New York, it's on the very high end as well, as I'm sure you all know, and that's at $14,500 a year. So as a point of reference, the average annual cost for an infant in center-based childcare was higher than a year's tuition and fees at a public college in 31 states plus DC, which is a pretty startling statistic. And so as a result, low-income and poor parents often find themselves having to balance financial solvency against their children's needs, essentially. They can't afford leave time, and they also can't afford quality childcare. So on the next slide. So I'd like to turn to the benefits of paid family leave. So for babies, for families, and then as our society and nation as a whole. So research does show that a period of paid leave after birth contributes to the healthy development of infants and toddlers. So time at home gives parents the time they need to breastfeed, to attend well-child medical visits, 9 of which are needed just in the first year, and that doesn't include any visits when the baby is sick. That's just well-child visits. And it also helps parents to ensure that their children are receiving all of their necessary immunizations. So studies show that paid leave yields higher rates and longer periods of breastfeeding, which then subsequently reduces the rates of childhood infections. Time off for parents also helps the early detection of potential developmental delays at a time when problems really can be most effectively addressed as early as possible. And then longer leave periods also benefit mom. The benefits include declines in depressive symptoms, a reduction in the likelihood of severe depression as well, and then improvements in overall health. And then finally, we can't forget the dads either. Fathers who take time off after the birth or adoption of their baby, they're more likely to be involved in their child's life moving forward. We can go to the next slide. So the benefits don't stop with each individual family. Paid leave policies, they benefit employers, they benefit taxpayers and the economy both now and in the future, as you've heard from a few of the presenters today. When parents are able to attend to a child's early medical needs, we reduce infant mortality and the occurrence and length of childhood illnesses, and that in turn lowers private and public health expenditures. So parents who can spend more time with their infants are also in a position to be wiser consumers of child care when they go back to work. So paid leave gives them time to actually search for the child care that meets the needs of their families, because everybody's needs are different. And this facilitates greater productivity when they return to their jobs. So simply put, it gives them peace of mind so that they can actually focus on their work when they're ready to go back. And then finally, these positive, consistent relationships really do yield confident individuals who are better equipped to succeed both in school and then later in life as well, which paves the way for a higher quality workforce and strong economic growth. The next slide. So at 0 to 3, our work is really centered around carving out a safe space for babies and families. And, we think by leaving paid leave up to circumstance, our country is it's ensuring that the families who cannot afford leave will not take it. This is dangerous for children, but it also results in high cost to society and our country in the long run. Yet, as we all know, policies continue to favor reaction over prevention in this area. And we think the question really does come down to, would we really rather pay for remedial education and juvenile justice and costs like that down the line, rather than promoting health and self-sufficiency and success in young families? And so up on the slide here, I wanted to just highlight a recent fact sheet that 0 to 3 did in partnership with the New York Paid Leave Insurance Campaign, and I believe Donna Dolan is on the webinar today, as well as the National Partnership for Women and Families. And we hope that it's an advocacy tool that you all can use as you continue your work in New York. And then last slide, please. So thank you so much for having me participate, and especially for the focus on child development as you continue your advocacy. I encourage you to learn more about 0 to 3's policy and advocacy efforts. You can join our policy network with the link up on your screen. We have a federal policy blog where we do regularly report on what's happening nationally with paid family leave. And then, of course, you can always connect with us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. So thank you so much again, and I'll turn it back over to Dina.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. Now I'd like to turn it over to my fantastic co-president, Sherry Lee Want, who co-founded A Better Balance in 2005 and has worked really for decades on the intersection of women's rights and poverty issues, including reproductive health, violence, and child care issues, and for a decade has been working on issues around leave both here in New York and nationwide. Sherry, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Dina, and thank you so much to everyone who's presented on this webinar. It's, we talk all the time about the need for paid family leave, but all of this research really goes deep and shows just so clearly why it's needed and how desperately it's needed, especially by the low-income workers around the country. So in the United States, there is no right to pay for extended leave to care for a new child or a seriously ill family member. Most Americans are forced to depend on their employer's personnel policies for support during those critical life moments. And as Dina said in the introduction, there are very, very few private sector employers, private sector workers who have access to paid family leave separate from their other benefits, and only 5% of low-wage workers. Forced to depend on paid sick time, paid vacation time, most of the low-wage workers and young workers aren't going to have enough time to take a really extended leave or the kind of extended leave that's necessary to address the problems that you heard about from the research that was just presented. So we really do have a crisis of care in this country when it comes to new children in a household and also taking care of seriously ill family members. The current legal landscape, I just want to, is it's very easy to present because it's very limited. The major protection for families that have a new child or a seriously ill family member is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which is a federal law that entitles some workers in the United States to take up to 12 weeks of leave and be guaranteed their job back. But there are very big holes in the FMLA. A major one is that it only applies to larger businesses, workplaces with 50 or more employees. So that leaves out right off the bat many, many workers who work for smaller businesses. It only applies if you've worked for 1,250 hours in a year, so a lot of part-time workers are also excluded. And most of all, again, looking at the research that Deb Nancy presented on the hardships of taking unpaid leave, it is unpaid. Yeah. What about paid leave? Well, the United States and Papua New Guinea, as well as Swaziland, are the only countries in the world, or out of 185 countries in the world, that don't provide some kind of guarantee to paid leave. And all developed countries, or what we think of as developed countries, have some access to paid leave for families that have a new child. So we really are an outlier here in the United States. Three states have changed that. They've enacted laws that do offer paid leave for new children or seriously ill family members, and those states are California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. In New York, we have something that's called the Temporary Disability Insurance Program. It's an insurance program that's financed by payroll deductions and employer contributions, payroll deductions from both employees and employers. And it provides up to 26 weeks of benefits when a worker is temporarily disabled from a non-job-related injury. For mothers, for pregnant workers and those who give birth, there is entitlement to some benefit under the Temporary Disability Insurance Program, and that's usually about 6 to 8 weeks of benefits. That's all to the good, except that benefits haven't been raised since 1989, and they stand at half of your salary up to $170 a week, so that almost all workers will get the $170, but that is a very small benefit, and it's really small in comparison to other states that have a temporary disability insurance program. So I want to talk about our proposal here in New York to try to expand the temporary disability insurance program so that it will cover family care, paid leave for a family that has a new child, paid leave for families with seriously ill family members who need their care. And again, we would use the TDI program, but we would raise the benefit levels for both TDI and make that the benefit levels also for the family care program. It would simply be a new section that would provide for this family care, and that would give up to 12 weeks of leave to care for a new child in the family or a seriously ill family member. And we've also put in certain military family needs that are currently in the FMLA. The bill would apply to all private employees. There's no threshold, business size threshold, applies across the board, and it contains an opt-in provision for public employees through their unions. And we have put in job protection for taking this benefit. The cost would be paid for by small employee payroll contributions. The family care part of this would only be paid for by employee payroll contributions. It would be capped in the first year at least at 45 cents per week. After the first year, the cost would be considered what would be needed to continue the program, and the Superintendent of Financial Services would determine the deduction needed. But the experience of other states that have paid family leave indicates that it will always be a very inexpensive benefit, and that's partly because it's only used a few times in most workers' lives, and so it is just not an expensive program. So even though the cost might go up a little, it probably would not go up a lot. There's no cost to the state or cost to business for the family care part of this program. There is some cost to business for raising the TDI benefit because that's a shared cost, but again, that is not going to be a lot of money. So there are only 5 states in the United States that have a temporary disability insurance program: California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and New York. And as I mentioned before, California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island have already passed paid family leave programs. So we feel very strongly that New York should be next. It would be an easy addition to our TDI program, and it really is. When it's described to many people, they just say, well, it's a no-brainer, and indeed it is. So I just want to update. We want to leave enough time for questions, so I'll quickly just update you on where we are politically on this bill. We've been proposing paid family leave in New York for many years. I think it's 12. It's passed the New York State Assembly 4 times, most recently this March. What we need is for the New York Senate to pass a paid family leave program, and we need the governor to champion this issue. Time is definitely running out for this session, which ends next week. But we will be back, and we have a very robust campaign going on. Up on your screen are the members of the steering committee of the paid family leave campaign, and we've been working together to try and make this a reality here in New York. We're organizing around the state, particularly upstate Long Island, and here in New York City, and we are really optimistic that this is going to happen in the next year. So what can you do? Share your story. We need human faces to be put on this problem. I thank Nancy again for doing that. We have a website where you can add your story. It's up on the screen, the website. Tell your state senator that we need paid family leave in New York, and sign our petition in support of paid family leave. We have 13,000 signers now. It's a petition to the governor indicating how desperately we need paid family leave here in New York, and comments have been really incredible in terms of supporting the need for this policy. And please keep in touch with us. This is our website, and with Dina and me, the rest of our staff, the other people on the steering committee, if you have any questions or want to get involved. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. So with that, I think we have just about 5 minutes, and we'll take a few questions. And the first one I think may actually be for you, Sherry. Comes from a caller. The new proposal would provide up to 12 weeks of paid family leave. How does the timing work in the new program? The current TDI covers 6 weeks for vaginal birth, 8 weeks for cesarean. How would someone go about getting the full paid 12 weeks? Would you have to have a specific medical need to be out for longer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that proving that you had a child and that you have a child to take care of is the same test that you'd have to do for TDI. This is indeed an additional benefit. It would be for bonding with a new child. So a birth mother would still get the 6 to 8 weeks in the proposal that passed the Assembly. The birth mother would still get the 6 to 8 weeks. And in addition, there would be a 12-week benefit for bonding. Fathers and adopteds are not covered now at all under our TDI program. Under the Assembly bill, they would get 12 weeks. So that's how it would work. I don't think the proof is that, it's not that difficult. It would just be showing that there's a new child in the family.
Great. And a follow-up to that, would the New York paid leave apply to all businesses based in New York? What happens if you work in New York and live in another state, like New Jersey, for example?
Yeah, this has come up a lot recently. We're working in a lot of states, actually. This year has been an explosive year in interest in new state programs, even in states that don't have a TDI program. And the question is, how does it apply to people who go across state boundaries? Most usually, all of the programs that we are aware of and that we've been writing for mostly do cover you. You are covered for the work that you do, where your employer is, where your work is. So if you work New Jersey has paid family leave. So if you work in New Jersey, you get paid family leave under the New Jersey program. If we pass a program in New York and you work in New York, it doesn't matter where you live. You would be covered in New York. We often get calls actually from people who live in New Jersey and work in New York and say, "Am I covered for paid family leave?" And we have to say, "No, you're not. Only if you're employed in New Jersey, because it's based on a payroll tax, and so it's tied to your employer, to where you're working."
Thanks, Sharon. I think this is a question for Deb. From the data you presented, it looks like most women already have some form of money coming in while they're on leave. What's the problem?
Well, while it's true that 41% of women took only paid leave and 16% took a combination of paid leave and unpaid time off, based on the national numbers of paid leave, and we saw that in a couple of the presentations, 11%, 12%, we're concerned that the lack of comprehensive policy means that women are taking very short amounts of time following the birth of their child because of financial need. So about 1/3 of women reported that financial need influenced their return to work, and 1/5 reported that they had exhausted their leave time. Research from other states points to the importance of duration of leave to impact health outcomes, and that is highly associated with whether or not leave is paid.
Great. Thank you. I think this is a question for Liz. It's from Brian, who wants to know what's more beneficial for a baby, mom and dad paid family leave at the same time, or dad following mom? Can you speak to the benefits for the baby?
Sure. So I have not seen research that's looked at sort of whether the leaves are taken at the same time or layered on top of each other, but we do know that there are unique benefits with both mom being home and then dad being home as well. And we also know that, it takes months for babies to form their secure attachments with their primary caregivers. So that can be moms and dads. And, the capacity to really even recognize a caregiver's voice and their face doesn't develop until 3 months of age. And so whether it's the leaves taken together or layering on top or layering in succession, we know that it does take months.
Thank you. And then I think in the final question, the last couple minutes for Nancy, you really underscored how women in the focus groups weren't aware about TDI. What do you think can be done to address this? I will just plug that A Better Balance does have, we have a new TDI fact sheet, and obviously we need to modernize TDI in addition to raising awareness. But Nancy, the question for you is what can be done to get the word out about TDI?
Well, I think a few things can be done. I mean, we can do, there needs to be a big education push from the state. That's public information, like we did with paid sick days in New York City. And there needs to be outreach to employers to remind them that they have this responsibility. There needs to be stronger enforcement. There needs to be test cases where it's enforced that people who were not informed of their right to TDI. But the other thing that needs to happen is we need to think about better ways to educate new moms and pregnant women, whether we want to do outreach to obstetricians to tell them that they need to let their patients know as soon as they're treating a pregnant woman, they need to let her know about her eligibility for TDI in the state of New York.
Excellent. Well, we are at 3:00, and in the interest of keeping to our schedule, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us, and to all the presenters for the fantastic presentations. And you can access all of our websites and all the information through the PowerPoints, and feel free to reach out at any point with follow-up questions. So thank you again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tina.